Hey, what's up everyone? My name is Dom. Welcome to On-Chain Rust, where we talk about all things Rust as it pertains to the blockchain. Thanks for joining me today. Hey, this is my first video. I just want to say that, like many of you, I'm just getting started with this stuff. I mean, it's relatively new technology. I know Rust's been around for a little bit, but a lot of these blockchains that are coming out that are now starting to use Rust are pretty new. And I think there's a lot of us that are just getting started or want to get started. And so I wanted to make these videos not only to help enhance my learning, but maybe help some of you that are in the same boat as me. So having said that, let's go ahead and get started. We're going to talk about Substrate today. Now, Substrate is a framework for developing blockchains. It was developed by the good folks over at Parity Tech, who were founded by Dr. Gavin Wood, who is also the co-founder and ex-CTO of Ethereum. He wrote the famous yellow paper for Ethereum, and he developed the Solidity smart contract programming language. Now, back in 2017, they did the initial ICO for Polkadot, and Parity saw a lot of the problems going on with the blockchains at the time, and they thought that they could do better. So they created Polkadot to address some of these issues. And one of the biggest issues is scalability. So with everything operating on one chain, like say with something like Ethereum, you run into scalability issues, you run into network congestion issues, which can eventually lead to increased transaction fees. And so instead of having all these different decentralized apps working off of one chain, why not make each of these things their own blockchain? And that's exactly what they did. So they wanted to allow developers to build fully customizable blockchains, scalable, allow them to interoperate with each other, and to also be able to communicate to other blockchains that aren't on the Polkadot network, such as Ethereum or Bitcoin or any other thing out there that may have a what they call a bridge to communicate with that blockchain. And they wanted developers to develop on Polkadot and get some of the benefits that already exist with Polkadot, such as the security enhancements, its eco-friendly consensus algorithm, and that it's easy to upgrade the runtime. So here's a visual of what Polkadot looks like. Basically, you have this relay chain, which is like a wheel. You have all these parachains, which are like spokes coming out of the wheel, and they are all independent, and they all execute and operate independently and in parallel to one another, but they all can communicate through this relay chain and then through bridges that exist out to other blockchains. So Substrate claims to be the only flexible, open, interoperable, and future-proof blockchain framework. I can easily say, or I guess arguably, it is the easiest way to build a blockchain today. So why build your own blockchain? Well, as I talked about earlier, single chains just don't scale well. You end up with transaction bottlenecks, increased transaction fees. And I mean, just imagine, so on Ethereum, somebody drops a hot NFT one day. Now everybody's trying to get that thing, and the transaction fees go up. And even though your decentralized app has nothing to do with any of that, you're paying the cost through the transactions that come through. And so they said, well, instead of us having these smart contracts that get executed by the EVM, which lives on the blockchain, why don't we just allow developers to build the logic directly into the blockchain? And so that's what they did. So there's three approaches with Substrate. There's Substrate Node, Substrate Frame, and Substrate Core. We're going to be focusing on Substrate Frame since I think that's the scenario most people will use. However, I will say that Substrate Node, you can deploy a blockchain within minutes, right? You just give it a configuration file and you're off to the races. Substrate Core is a little more freeform. You just have to be able to compile your runtime to WebAssembly, and you can put that out on the chain. But Substrate Frame is probably the way most people are going to go because it provides a framework for developing that runtime. So here is the client architecture for the Substrate client. You get all these facilities such as the peer-to-peer networking, RPC, consensus storage, but this WASM runtime right here is what you will be building when you take your Rust code and compile it into WebAssembly and deploy it out to the blockchain. So again, the WASM runtime is just a business logic, and all throughout the documentation, they also call this the state transition function. So in this diagram, you have this inner circle, which is your runtime that you build with your application logic. That's all built in Rust, but it's compiled to WebAssembly. The consensus storage and all these facilities that are common to all blockchains, those are also written in Rust, but those are compiled into native code. Then you have your external libraries such as lib peer-to-peer, JSON RPC. So one of the really cool things about Substrate is its forkless runtime upgrades. I talked about this a little bit earlier, but basically the WebAssembly that you build when you compile your Rust code to create that runtime, it gets deployed and stored on chain. And then it gets pushed out to all the nodes on the network as part of the general consensus process. So it's pretty sweet. Before you would have this, or actually even today, you have this concept of a hard fork, right? Where all the nodes are running one set of rules. Now you have this new set of rules you want to introduce to the network. Well, you have to coordinate and synchronize all these nodes to upgrade to that new rule set. But you're still going to have some that aren't going to upgrade. So then you basically end up with this fork of the old and the new. Whereas with Substrate, once that runtime is deployed out there on the chain, all the nodes can get the update right away. So Substrate uses these modules, which are called pallets, in order for you to configure the runtime. And Frame gives you some existing pallets which you can choose from, and you can also write your own. So in this diagram, you can see you have a bunch of different pallets to choose from. You go ahead and configure those for your runtime based on whatever it needs to do or whatever you want it to do. And then that gets included in your runtime into the WebAssembly that you build. So here is a skeleton program of what a pallet looks like. I'm not going to go over all this, but if you were to build your own pallet, you'd probably start somewhere here. There's a place for you to define it. There's a place for you to define your storage, any events that you have, your configuration, and then your extrinsics, which are basically pieces of information that exist off-chain that you want to store on-chain. So when it comes to deploying your blockchain, you have a couple of options. You can deploy onto Polkadot as a parachain and not use Substrate. You can use Substrate and not deploy on the Polkadot. You can just basically have your own solo chain. Or you can do something in the middle, which is deploying your Substrate developed blockchain onto Polkadot as a parachain. And I think this is what most people end up doing. It is probably the easiest way to develop them. Deploy your own blockchain, plus you get a lot of the goodness that comes with Polkadot. So now the question is, why Rust? I mean, Polkadot is not, and Substrate, they're not the only networks or platforms that are using Rust as a programming language. It's a systems programming language. Why are we using it for blockchain development or smart contract development? And the reason is because, well, there's a lot of reasons, but one of the main ones is it has first-class support for WebAssembly. A lot of these blockchains are using WebAssembly as a way to execute code on the blockchain. It's also type safe, it's memory safe, there's no runtime overhead or very little, there's no garbage collector like you have with languages like Python or C# or Java. It has some advanced compiler optimizations like tree shaking for getting rid of dead code. And it has a great ecosystem already. I mean, between Cargo and Crates.io, the existing tooling, and the text editor and IDE support, they're all first class and top notch. Plus, as Rust evolves and gets new features, those also get baked in to your smart contract or blockchain development programming language. So all the way around, it's just a good deal for both Rust developers and for blockchain developers. Some of the downsides, though, are if you're new to development, Rust has quite a bit of steep learning curve. I mean, even for an experienced developer, I think there's a bit of a learning curve there with some of the syntax. but the concepts are the same if you're familiar with other object-oriented languages or functional languages. A lot of those concepts transcend Rust, but they have different names that maybe you're not used to. And the syntax, like I said, is a little bit hard to get used to at first, but once you get going with it, you get used to it. And actually, you end up enjoying it. You know, I know it's probably cliche to say at this point, but Rust is one of the favorite languages amongst developers. I think it's won that award on Stack Overflow like for several years now. So for whatever that's worth, once you get going, you'll start to enjoy it, and it's just a great language all the way around. So one thing I do love about Substrate is the documentation. I mean, it's a great framework. They really thought this through. It's very modular, very nice to program in, but the documentation on top of it is just top notch, and the learning resources they have as well. You can even just get started, like say, hey, I don't want to install Rust and do all this stuff to try it out. You know, they have these things called playgrounds that basically you can just launch a development environment in your browser and start playing around right away. They also have a ton of tutorials out on the website, which I highly recommend that you check out. We'll be doing some of these on the channel here. We'll walk through them as well as other coding exercises. But in the meantime, I suggest going and checking these out and building some of these yourself. They're pretty cool. And then if you're already familiar with the Rust standard library documentation, you'll be right at home with the documentation for Substrate. Like I said, everything is super well documented. And that's all I got for today. Thanks for joining me again. We'll be going over a lot more in regards to Substrate and other blockchains in the future. If you like this video, if you found it helpful, please smash that like button. If you think someone else could benefit from this information, please share it with them. And I will see you in the next one.